Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's webinar, which is organized by the AEPF, Asia-Europe People's Forum. The webinar is titled Sedition Laws Have No Place in Democracies, Interface with Parliamentarians. The AEPF is a network of civil society organizations and a social movement that works across Asia and Europe on pro-people alternatives that challenge the dominant economic, social, and political narratives. It works for ecologically just and sustainable policies. They are linked with hundreds of movements across over 40 countries of Asia and Europe. Today, we are delighted to be part of the AEPF webinar, which is launching these series that cut across our concerns on the right to dissent, the first of which is sedition laws have no place in democracies. The next two webinars will talk on the difficult situation that journalists find themselves in these days on the challenges faced by human rights activists. This webinar series follows the AEPF People's Forum plenary on right to dissent, is at the heart of democracies and the 10-country report that the AEPF has done on this issue. Do follow their social media channels to receive updates on these follow-up webinars. Today's webinar will be recorded and the video will be made available on the AEPF website. My name is Hina Jilani. I will be the moderator today. And just to let you know a little bit about myself, I'm a lawyer and a human rights activist. I practice in the Supreme Court of Pakistan. I'm currently the head of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, which is the largest NGO on human rights in Pakistan. I'm also a member of the Elders, which is a group of world personalities who were brought together by Nelson Mandela to speak for the people who have no voice. I'm very proud to be a part of that group. I have also served as the special representative of the UN Secretary General on Human Rights Defenders. So really know how the current topic that we are discussing has really, in many ways, affected the right to defend human rights and how human rights defenders, whether they are journalists, lawyers, NGO workers, student leaders, labor leaders, how they were affected by the kind of laws that we will be discussing today and the kind of political environment in which voices are silenced through repressive legislations. Let me also give you a little bit of my background. Strangely enough, my incarcerations during military regimes have also been under the sedition laws, or like similar laws that military dictators imposed as martial law regulations. You know, in 1983, I was arrested and put in prison, and the charges against my preventive detention were that I was spreading despondency amongst the population. Now, remember, this is a period when they had executed a popularly elected prime minister. There were public hangings, flogging of journalists and political activists. There were extrajudicial stoning of women incidents. I mean, I ask you, in this environment, I am the one who's spreading despondency, who's asking for the restoration of democracy, of the constitution and the rule of law. These are the kind of ridiculous charges that are usually framed against those who are working for the restoration of democracy, of the rule of law, of peace and stability, and asking for respect for human rights. Incidentally, my father was also charged several times under these laws, and many of the well-known cases that are associated with his incarcerations during military regimes in the 60s and 70s have today become some landmarks cases by the Supreme Court of Pakistan on detention under sedition laws. I have many friends in India, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Philippines who have been prosecuted under these sedition laws in their countries. Most of them were opposition leaders, human rights defenders, activists, journalists, lawyers. So I do have a fairly wide experience of how many countries have used these laws to silence people, to silence counter narratives that are being developed in order to counter the official narratives that go towards authoritarianism, that are based on ultranationalism and certain defined parameters which they want to impose on us as patriotism. I've also defended many such friends and fellow human rights defenders in court. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a subject that obviously is of great interest to you, but I'm sure that it is also a subject throughout the Asian region, which would be of very close interest and of interest to everyone who is engaged in a struggle for democracy, for rule of law, and respect for human rights. We have a very eminent panel of speakers today who will enlighten us, not just on the laws themselves, but more importantly on the use of these kind of laws. We have 3 speakers who were not able to join us live, but they have sent their messages through videos. And I will, first of all, introduce to you our first video presenter, Charles Santiago. Charles Anthony Santiago is a Malaysian politician from the Democratic Action Party, currently serving as 3-term member of Parliament of Malaysia for the Kelang constituency in the state of Selangor. He is chairperson of ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. So please see his video presentation.
Call for their repeal and call for their abolishment. Authorities in Malaysia have long targeted critics using the 1948 Sedition Act, hangover of a British colonial rule in the country, and those found guilty under the law can face up to 3 years in prison for the first offence or up to 5 years for subsequent offences. Its continued use by the government against the critics makes it clear that it is a tool for them to try and silence those who have opinions which they don't like, which governments don't like. So alternative arguments, alternative narratives are issues that governments and powers that be do not like. So whenever you come up with alternative ideas, you come up with new ideas, critical of government, especially critical of government, then the law is applied against you. I have been investigated by the government for sedition, and there are 2 cases pending against me for having raised issues on the multimedia law and also other laws that are involving the government. Investigation is still pending, and I have not got any reaction from the government whether the case is going forward or whether I'll be charged soon. So I just have to wait for the government to respond. Now, even something like what we enjoy, cartoons, for example, even cartoons in Malaysia are being feared by the government. So we have a very famous cartoonist in Malaysia called Zuna, and he's not only is he famous in Malaysia, he's famous all over the place. He's also facing charges against sedition and a possible 3-year jail sentence for criticizing political parties and politicians. So it's quite clear, sedition is used by the government in order to silence dissenters. That's the key purpose of having a sedition law. The government has claimed that the law is used to address issues related to sensitive societal issues. But this is a flawed argument, an argument that has been completely, as a failed argument actually. Disagreements, even on sensitive issues, it must be pointed out, is crucial for democracy. Suppressing discussions, criticisms and debate is a violation of the right to freedom of expression. It's not only in Malaysia, however, that sedition is being used to silence and threaten dissenters or government opponents. In Thailand, for example, similar charges were brought against the Future Forward Party before its dissolution in February 2020. And the charges were sedition, charges against the country's criminal code in a bizarre case that sought to link the party to the Illuminati, a mythical conspiracy, and accusing it of seeking to overthrow the monarchy. Although the charges were eventually dropped, it was part of a campaign of judicial harassment against the party and its members that sought to stifle and undermine the work they were doing. Growing democracy protests in Thailand saw protest leaders slammed with sedition charges in a mass trial in early 2021. In Myanmar, many of the thousands who have been arbitrarily detained since the coup, including Aung San Suu Kyi, have faced sedition charges. The sedition law, notably 505A of the Penal Code, has been amended since the coup in an attempt to guarantee impunity for the Myanmar military leaders who seized power in a coup in February. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, sedition charges were quite uncommon prior to Duterte's assumption to power. However, in recent years, we have seen it used against political opponents and government critics. In 2019, the government filed sedition, cyber libel, and libel charges against 35 individuals, including the country's vice president, human rights lawyers, and Catholic religious leaders. They have been cleared from these charges in 2020 by the country's Department of Justice. The country's cybercrime also provides a provision on cyber sedition. It has the potential to arrest critics posting anti-government sentiments online. So it's quite clear that the sedition law is not only used in Malaysia in a big way to silence dissenters, but also members of political parties, members of non-governmental organizations, environmentalists, and also people and religious groups as well, as in the case of the Philippines. So this is a region-wide phenomenon. This is a region-wide phenomenon, a phenomenon that we have to fight back, and we have to work quite hard in order to make sure to take it away from the law books, to repeal it, so that we can have a robust discussion on a variety of issues without the fear of sedition charges against you. Now, the second question is whether I have been deterred by or silenced by the Sedition Act. The answer is no. In fact, it gives me greater, being charged by the Sedition Act gives me greater encouragement in order to fight back and fight for my rights, because I have the right as a citizen of a country, as a member of a political party, as a member of a non-governmental organization, to voice my concerns, to voice the rights of the people, to give voice to the voiceless in order to make changes that is betterment for society at large. So therefore, it has not silenced me, and it has not silenced my friends and my colleagues who continue to struggle against this arcane law and a British law that, in the case of Malaysia, that we have inherited. Now, the third point I've been asked to speak on is how do we ensure that it is not misused. In the case of Malaysia, we will continue to press harder, and we will continue to advocate among my colleagues in Parliament and also non-governmental organizations, including trade unions, including religious organizations, to repeal the Sedition Act by citing examples of countries already eradicating such an archaic piece of legislation. One example would be Singapore, but with the caveat that we do not replicate what they did by replacing it with other similar repressive laws. So we don't want to go the Singapore route. We want to abolish it. We want to take it out. We want to repeal it. But we do not want to replace, like in the case of Singapore, replace the Sedition Act with even more repressive laws. This is something that we really want to. So we have to follow a good example, but remove it. This one has to be, say it again. I'm going to say it again. What we need to do in the case of Malaysia, what is the way forward on this? One, we have to repeal it. We have to repeal it and to ensure that worse repressive laws or more repressive laws are not introduced to replace it, as in the case of Singapore. And this is something that we have to keep in mind as we work towards repealing, working against the Sedition Act. Also in Malaysia, we continue to lobby for the ratification and the implementation in law, policy and practice of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other human rights treaties at the earliest opportunity. In Southeast Asia, through our network of parliamentarians in the region, we will carry out the same advocacy. And in countries where elections will take place, we will work together with civil society, stakeholders, including religious organizations, trade unions, and environmental groups, to demand the abolition of sedition measures. Becomes an electoral agenda and promised by the candidates as they put forward their various manifestos in elections. And lastly, work with and support ongoing campaigns calling for the abolition of sedition laws in the region. And I think one can also further say that maybe there should be a network of NGOs, political parties in the region, working together, lobbying together, sharing information, and campaigning together in order to bring the end of sedition, not only in Malaysia, but in ASEAN as a whole. Thank you very much. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Charles, for your very informative as well as very thoughtful and provocative presentation. I think it's very important for us, from what Charles has said, to question, the whole issue of the efficacy of such laws in the current context of these, the current political context in our region. Should we then not ask ourselves the question, is democracy really participatory in this region if people are not allowed to dissent, if people are not allowed the right to participate in governance by pointing out and exposing malgovernance, lack of respect for human rights, and the lack of respect for basic and fundamental values of democracy? These are questions that I think our next speaker may be able to answer. So I will now introduce our next video presentation, which is from Francis Kiko Pangilinan, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing the name right. Francis is president of the Liberal Party of the Philippines and chairperson of the Council of Asian Liberals and Democrats. He champions human rights, social justice, and the rule of law. Among the laws he has passed are the Juvenile Justice Act, which segregates youth offenders from hardened criminals, and the Farmers and Fisher Folk Enterprise Development Act, which seeks to revolutionize agriculture by putting food producers, their incomes, and their welfare front and center in the developing sector. He has earned the anger of the ruling party in the Philippines for speaking out against mass murder disguised as war on drugs, misogyny, and its overall relentless attacks on freedom and democracy. So let's hear what Francis has to say.
Greetings of peace and solidarity to the Asia-Europe People's Forum, and greetings as well to fellow progressive parliamentarians who believe in and strive for a democracy that is truly of, for, and by the people. If democracy has a secret sauce, it is dissent. Dissent is the essence of democracy. But as the interest of people does not necessarily coincide with the interest of the state, authoritarian governments always seek to control people's freedom of expression, of speech, and of peaceful assembly, to curb criticism, to curb or silence dissent. Laws on sedition have been used by the Marcos regime when I was a student leader and activist in the 80s to do this. They have been used to threaten me and fellow activists in the university many years ago. I, myself, have been subjected to the filing of inciting to sedition cases during my student activist days in the University of the Philippines. Now, we also have the anti-terror law, which we voted against in the year 2020. In the Philippines, actual killings of the so-called nobodies, including street thugs and small-time drug couriers, have been used to terrorize everyone. Those who serve as check to the tremendous state power, journalists, lawyers, and judges have also become assassination targets. Over and above this, extrajudicial way to curb dissent are laws that make it more difficult to cry, ouch, that hurts, to propose a better way and to participate in a democracy. I, together with other freedom-loving Filipinos, have questioned the constitutionality of our anti-terror law before our Supreme Court. Oral arguments have concluded and we await judgment. In the meantime, we persevere. We love, as our Vice President, and with God's grace and the support of our citizens, the next President, Leni Robredo, tells us to do so. We continue to exercise our freedom to express love. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this topic. Mabuhay, and again, good day to everyone.
Thank you very much, Francis. I think what you have said bears testimony to the fact that there are growing instances to show throughout this region that this law has been weaponized as a handy tool against political rivals to suppress dissent. I think we all agree with this. Many of us sitting here are living examples of how any kind of dissent that we have mounted against serious violations of human rights, exploitative practices and policies of governments against the more marginalized and vulnerable sections of our populations, or any attempt that we have made to rationalize narratives in order to gather support for democracy, for peace, and for stability in our communities. So I do believe that these are some of the important issues that we need to not just ponder upon in our isolation, but also to discuss them, to make them a center of debate, public debate, so that we together can raise these issues, not just with our own parliamentarians and with our own courts, but also as an Asian campaign against these anachronistic laws that are really belonging to the colonial period where we had no democracy. I'm now going to present before you the video message and presentation of Shashi Tharoor, who is a well-known figure in South Asia. Shashi is a member of the parliament in India. He has been a member since 2009. He's from the Congress party. He represents the state of Kerala. He was earlier Under Secretary General of the United Nations. Shashi is a prolific writer and commentator, and I'm very proud to call Shashi my friend. So let's hear what Shashi has to say.
Hello, I'm Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram in Kerala, India. And I'm pleased to join you all, particularly under the chairmanship of my old friend Hina Jilani, to talk about the right to dissent, which we all agree is the basis for accountable governance and social cohesion in any country that considers itself a democracy. But we have a problem, and that problem is very clear. It's that in India we are still suffering the after effects of a colonial era sedition law, Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, which was actually drafted by the British, not enacted when the Penal Code was enacted initially in 1861, but brought in the 1890s and strengthened with the then British officialdom proclaiming loudly and clearly that the version of the sedition law imposed upon India as a colony was intended to be tougher, more stringent and more onerous than the version then applicable in the United Kingdom itself. Under this section 124A, any person who uses words, signs or visible representation to excite disaffection against the government of India shall be charged with sedition, and that will require imprisonment extending all the way up to life imprisonment. Now, what I've tried to do as a Member of Parliament in India with a private member's bill was to offer an amendment that would read some of this down, to say that individuals, citizens of India, are only liable to be charged with sedition only when their words or signs or actions directly result in the use of violence or incitement to violence and actually constitutes an offence which is itself punishable with imprisonment for life. In other words, if what they're saying or prompting or exhorting leads to culpable homicide, murder and rape, or any of those, then clearly there are grounds to proceed against them. But mere words or signs criticising the measures taken by the government, administrative actions of the government, should not constitute sedition. I propose, in other words, that the Penal Code be amended to promote the freedom of speech and the right to express dissent against the government, while ensuring safeguards against the use of words to incite violence. Now, why did I do this? Because we actually have a very famous Supreme Court case going back to 1962, which, in its court, Kedarnath Singh versus the state of Bihar, actually first both upheld the validity of Section 124A and linked it to a test of tangible evidence of actual harm. But the lower courts in India and the investigating authorities have continually overlooked this interpretation of the Supreme Court, and dozens of sedition cases are filed every month across the country under the law and order responsibilities of various state governments. It's almost as if the police force has not been given any training in the Supreme Court interpretation. And so my own view was that to actually insert an amendment that would make this explicitly clear would change the law and make it impossible to prosecute people on insufficient or frivolous grounds, as is happening too easily in the Indian system. Now, I do want to stress that, of course, sedition has a pernicious history in colonial India. It was an instrument to terrorize Indians and implicate in particular nationalist newspapers in a major crime. Any newspaper that disapproved of British colonialism and wrote against it was liable to be proceeded against. Some of India's most prominent nationalist heroes, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Annie Besant, J.C. Bose, Mahatma Gandhi, Bhagat Singh, these are all amongst the prominent figures to be charged with sedition. And Mahatma Gandhi actually called it his moral duty to disobey this draconian provision. Prime Minister, India's first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, had said, in fact, just before the Constituent Assembly, or even during it, I think, that the sooner we get rid of it, the better. This is with specific reference to Section 124A. But the Constituent Assembly decided against the inclusion of sedition as one of the approved restrictions to the fundamental right of free speech. And since free speech is guaranteed under Article 19 of the Constitution, it is in some ways inexplicable that successive governments have allowed this provision to remain on the statute books. Now, I do want to say that successive governments, centre and state, have allowed this colonial legacy to continue unchecked, so I'm not taking a partisan political stand on it. But what we have seen in recent years, and I speak now as a member of the opposition, is the increasing use of the sedition provision to harass and intimidate journalists, human rights activists, artists, political workers, and even cartoonists and illustrators, according to the whims of the members of the state and central government that have decided to proceed against them. Ironically, the United Kingdom itself, which first imposed this law on us, has abolished sedition and seditious libel, labeling it in their own country as a repressive law that caused more harm than good. But if we are willing to take the bad from the Brits, it seems we're not willing to take the good, and we have not done what is necessary to scrap or drastically rewrite this law. My private member's bill got exactly nowhere. So, as I conclude my remarks on this panel, it's just to say there is no justification in a democracy to persist with the sedition law. There is, in my view, every argument available to scrap it or limit it severely only to acts of direct incitement to violence. And then we can once again allow dissent to flourish without the ever-present looming shadow of the threat of a prosecution for sedition. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Shashi. Let me here thank all the three speakers who made their presentations through the video, because they were not, unfortunately, not able to join us because of different other commitments at this time. So I thank them for their very thoughtful presentations. I think that all the three speakers have underlined how in recent years, activists, human rights defenders, and journalists have also been charged with and arrested for sedition for simply speaking out against or criticizing certain government actions or policies. I may also add, and Shashi has rightly pointed out, that the sedition laws have empowered the executive branch of government to use these ambiguously defined provisions as an instrument to regulate public opinion and to indiscriminately wield power over public discourse. Ironically, this colonial relic, which has its foundation in the belief that people are obligated to feel affection towards the government or else be punished, continues to thrive in a number of post-colonial states, including my own. Let me point out that international law is crystal clear on this, that criticism of the government and its institutions, even harsh criticism, is a protected form of expression. What governments usually do, and many parliaments fall behind such ideologies, they use the limitations allowed on the freedom of expression to destroy this right altogether. It is needless to say that in many countries, rulings by the judiciary clearly diverge from the interpretation of the sedition law by the executive and show how the law is being indiscriminately misused by them. Nevertheless, this is not an exercise that judiciaries have done in all countries. And there is a lot of lapse by the judiciary, in fact, and in many ways, I can safely say that in such instances where the judiciary deliberately ignores and deliberately avoids the either the reinterpretation or outright condemnation of such laws, they become collaborators to silencing dissent. So I do believe that the three speakers have just very clearly laid down the canvas, both with respect to the background and the environment in which we as human rights defenders, whether we are lawyers, journalists, human rights defenders, generally the civil society, we find it very difficult to promote the campaign against such laws. It is therefore one of the strategical thinkings that the civil society has to do on how we address this issue. We see the situation in Myanmar today. We see the situation in Afghanistan. We are experiencing such trends in our own countries. So it's not something that we are in any way unaware of. And I'm sure that the next few speakers that we have, fortunately, who are live with us in this webinar, will throw more light on the very fundamental issues regarding the laws on sedition, how they suppress the right to dissent, and how they fatally affect the freedom of expression, which in many countries that we all come from is a constitutional right that the civil society and the generations before us had to struggle a great deal to get into our constitution. Has that just been a paper victory for us? Let's examine what the answer to this question would be in the light of what our next speakers are going to say. It is my pleasure now to introduce Natalie Bennett, who is our next speaker. Natalie is one of the 2 Green Party members in the House of Lords. She joined the House in 2019. Before, she served 4 years as leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. Natalie is born in Australia, where she worked as a journalist. She continues working as a journalist after arriving in the UK and joined the Green Party in 2006. She served in many parliamentary groups, such as the Hong Kong Agroecology, Green New Deal, and Minorities. So, Natalie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm very honoured to be on such a distinguished panel with such a distinguished chair. And just to add that I did also live for 5 years in Thailand, where I was, 2 of those years, I was a volunteer for the National Commission on Women's Affairs. So I have some knowledge of and did some ASEAN work. So I have some knowledge of and continue to follow the kind of issues that we've just been hearing about. And I think there's probably 3 things that I'd really like to say. And one is first a general observation, really from the history of England. And that is, of course, that rights, opportunities are never simply handed over by those in power. They've always had to be struggled for, had to be won, and indeed they continue to have to be defended. I remember hearing a few years ago the feminist historian Sheila Rowbotham talking about how in the 1970s as a feminist, she'd thought, and feminists thought, we'd win one thing for the rights of women, then they'd move on to the next thing and keep progressively going forward. But in fact, this always has to be a continuing struggle. And this is a struggle, and I feel like speaking to you from the House of Lords here in London, an apology for so many of the messes that were left by colonialism and that continue to be enforced by neo-colonialism, by the power of multinational corporations, that all of these things are tremendously hard to struggle against. So point 1, we have to struggle. We're not going to get handed these things. But point 2 is there is real signs of hope, real international movements, and this seminar today is just one of them. And I was actually a couple of days ago at the meeting of the all-party parliamentary group, a new group on Magnitsky-style sanctions. And this is really interesting that it is actually civil society. It was started, the whole campaign was started by a man in America who was very angry about how an employee of his had been treated, his human rights were abused, and eventually led to the lawyer's death in Russia, that worked with many campaigners to introduce a new form of sanction. And the problem always has been historically, when human rights abuses, when states have done that, there was an extremely blunt instrument of sanctions, which would hit a whole country. Countries would be denied food, would be denied all sorts of essential things for life, and people who are in no way responsible suffered. But the great thing about Majinsky style sanctions is they are actually targeted at the individuals responsible. And so we've seen, not nearly enough yet, but and more joining all the time, signing up for these kind of sanctions. And it's been driven by civil society, and many of the use driven by. And another international civil society campaign that I'm involved in, I'll be at the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow from next week. And they're working with the people who are campaigning to create an international offence of ecocide under the Rome statutes. And what you have there is a real understanding that we are all as human beings entirely dependent on the natural world. We're trashing the natural world. And this is a civil society campaign driving to protect that natural world. So what we're seeing is a huge growth around the world. Nation states have really failed to deliver on protecting people's rights, protecting futures, but there is real civil society push around this. And I think the third thing that I want to say, the third point I would like to make, is that we are in what I described as the last zombie days of neoliberalism. We have had 40 years of a kind of political philosophy dominating much of certainly the Western world, and it's had huge impact all around the globe. That greed is good, inequality doesn't matter. The drive for profit will deliver everything. Companies just have to be let run free. And we've seen where that's got us. And this is difficult times. I'm very often reminded of Gramsci, the prison notebooks, that the old is dying, the new is yet to be born, and there's some pretty nasty symptoms in the meantime. And that's where we are now. And it's also the case, I just have to mention, in the UK, if you look at the government's legislative programme over the next 3 to 6 months, we have a policing bill that's seeking to repress protest, and very disturbingly is actually explicitly targeting the Roma, Gypsy and traveller community, which of course has to be a reminder of a horrific history from the past. We have a Nationality and Borders Bill that will seek to break international law by denying people desperately fleeing, seeking asylum in the UK, the right to that asylum, which the UK has been signed up to for decades. We've also got an elections bill that would put the Elections Commission underneath the control of the government. So that's another reminder that we have to fight for these things to win them, but then we also have to fight to keep them. But I want to finish on a note of hope. We really are seeing new opportunities. The old systems are breaking down. Those neo-colonialist, multinational dominated, extremely unequal, extractivist, disastrous models that we have seen, particularly dominant over the last 40 or 50 years, they are in a state of absolute crisis. And I commend to everyone tying together the sense of what's happening at the COP26 climate talks. That is a human rights event every bit as much as it's an environment event, and tying all of these things together. And what it needs is people to get together from all around the world. And we hear a lot of terrible things, people saying social media is terrible, but we can do things now today, like get together today in ways that would have been pretty well impossible in the past. So let's use all those tools available to us. Let's get together, let's support each other, work together for a world where there is genuinely freedom of speech, human rights, and a livable planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie, for this very illuminating presentation. And one of the most important things that you have said is about the central role of the civil society in contributing towards the creation of an open society, where whose views can be not just fearlessly expressed, but they represent in many ways the pluralism and the diversity of the many countries that we live in. This whole region is such a diverse region that unless we are able to express ourselves in terms of our identity, culture, etc., we will lose the very advantageous quality of our lives in the Asia Pacific. I think here I would like to say a few words on preserving democracy, rule of law, peace and stability. This is not mere rhetoric. I think it is important to understand that to be able to achieve these, certain freedoms have to be properly administered, responsibly exercised. And I think the recognition that the right to freedom of expression is essential for democracy and rule of law, etc., has to go with certain actions, both on the part of the civil society and also governments. The civil society is important in coercing governments to recognize that the state means the people more than governments. And where states take on an identity of their own and the interest of the states become in many ways in conflict with the interest of the people, it is there that we see repressive laws. And lawyers like myself and human rights, who are also human rights defenders, find a dilemma in talking about the rule of law and are then forced and compelled to define what we mean by rule of law. We don't mean the rule of law that encompasses laws that in themselves are repressive and become tools and instruments of repression. So there are many avenues in which civil society thinking needs to proceed. There are strategies that civil societies need to adopt to take further their role, which, as Natalie has said, is very central in making sure that these avenues remain open to us. Let me also say that freedom of expression is a multi-dimensional right. It is not only of significance in itself, but has a direct connection to fuller aspect for and more comprehensive protection of other rights. These include primarily and foremost the right to defend human rights. We can't defend human rights if we do not have the right to information, freedom of association, freedom of assembly and the right to protest, freedom of thought, religion and belief, the right to participate in public affairs, the right to good governance, the right to sustainable and inclusive development, and also the right of indigenous and ethnic, religious, linguistic minorities to preserve their own language and culture. So these are important things that I think we need to do more in order to impress upon governments that we not only have the responsibility to struggle for these rights and to strive towards the achievement of these rights, we have a responsibility and a duty and an obligation to do that. We have no alternative in repressive societies or in repressive states to launching and getting together to campaign for the removal of repressive legislation that restrains our ability to defend human rights. So further, I think the freedom of expression is also a necessary condition for the realization of the principles of transparency and accountability. These are central to good governance, without which democratic institutions and systems can neither protect and promote human rights, nor render legal and social justice to the people, which is a very critical need of the people of this region today. With these words, I would like now to introduce my compatriot, and excuse me for saying this, but somebody that I'm really very proud of, a young emerging political leader in Pakistan, who is mobilizing not just the youth in this country, but mobilizing our thoughts as well, mobilizing the youth towards an idealism that fosters democracy, that resists the trends of extremism, the trends of conservatism, the trends of government that repress our freedom to hold opinions and to bring change. So it is my pride really now to introduce Mohsen Javed Daur, who is a Pakistani politician. He's the chairperson of the National Democratic Movement. He's an activist in the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement and has been a member of the National Assembly of Pakistan since August 2018. So I call upon you, Mohsen, to give us an example from your own personal experiences, both as a parliamentarian, as a person who leads a movement towards resistance, on what you have experienced, both at the hands of institutions and at the hands of government. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mohsen.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind words, and thank you, Asia Europe People's Forum, for giving me the opportunity to speak on such an important issue. Well, I think before, instead of going into the background and the history of the way the sedition has been used as a tool by the colonial rulers here, because that's been already discussed by most of our speakers. I will like to switch on to the current scenario, the way it has been used as a continuation of the same colonial approach. I think after the creation of Pakistan, there would be hardly any dissenting voice left, any nationalist political leader left who hasn't been charged with this sedition law. Starting from Bacha Khan and almost majority of the leadership of NAP and till now, I think there has been hardly any dissenting voice who haven't faced this sedition law. The way the Pakistani state, the way constantly they have used, it has now become a signifier for the people who speak truth to the power. Like whoever whoever is charged with sedition law, he is considered to be a voice, a genuine voice of dissent. And it isn't limited just for the politician. In current scenario, we have witnessed, the way it has been used against journalists who are more critic, the way it has been used, the way some of the people related to the judiciary have been portrayed, although they haven't been charged directly with that, but they have been portrayed to someone like who has been committed sedition. And well, on the other hand, there are some forces who have really committed and who have been abrogated the constitution of the Pakistan. And one of the cases of Parvez Musharraf, who has been convicted by the court under Article 6, but still, the same judgment was once again, nothing has been done to implement that judgment. So it has been a continuation even after the colonial era, and we have been seen personally till now. I have been facing more than a dozen of sedition cases. I have been in prison for more than 4 months. Many of our comrades associated with Pashtun Tahaffuz movement and other political parties who are, critic of the military role in the region, they have faced the sedition charges. Currently, one of our member of parliament, Ali Wazir, he has been in jail for almost for more than 9 months, and he's struggling to get a date in the Supreme Court of Pakistan. And in all these cases, the only tool, the only evidence which they have got in almost all these cases is speech or a written statement, or in the recent cases, they have, they have charged people with sedition on just a Facebook post or a tweet or anything said on a social media. And in most of the cases, the content is so much low and so much funny that it's become very hard for even them to present the case in the court. Initially, they charge people, they arrest them, then they put them in the jail. But when they get out of the on the bail, and when the case is open for trial in the court, in that case, then there is nothing, there is no content with them to prosecute that person in the court. Eventually, they get out with that. They cannot convict people, but at least they prosecute and they scream as long as they can. In one of the such kind of case, the court passed a judgment that the government, they have just wasted the time of the prosecution, they have just wasted the time of the judiciary, but still, they keeps going on with that. And but now we have seen, like, it has been, we have, at least in after the emergence of the social power, social media, at least we have found some platform from where we can raise our voices against this kind of discrimination, against the misuse of sedition laws. And we have questioned many times that at least if someone can provide the data of how many times they have convicted, they have made it a success to convict people charged under these sedition laws. They haven't provided it till now. And it has been challenged, it has been presented, a bill has been presented in the Senate, and we are planning to present similar kind of a bill to repeal Section 121(4) in the National Assembly of Pakistan also. Well, again, to cut it short, the sedition laws that has been used as a weapon to silence the voices of dissent, although they have not succeeded in doing it so far, as one of our speakers in the start said, that they have tried too many times on us, and they have charged it with sedition charges. And the most trusted thing in Pakistan here is that in most of the cases, the sedition charges are coupled with the terrorism charges. The laws which are framed to curb and the laws which are framed to contain militancy, it has been used against the political workers. It has been used against the voices of the dissent. And almost every second FIR in which they use, which they include Section 124A, we have seen that it has been mostly coupled by the Section 7 of Anti-Terrorist Act also. So the people for which it has been framed, it's hardly used against them, and it's hardly been, we have hardly seen them convicting those militants under these laws. But to silence the voices of dissent, and to silence the political workers, they have used these laws as a weapon. So it's a kind of weaponization of laws. But now people are speaking, and we have forums like this on which we can speak. And I think a united effort from forums like that can really make a success. I would like to once again thank Asia Europe People's Forum for giving me the opportunity to express my views and share my experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohsin. At this point, I think it's important to realize that, legally speaking, one of the main problems with the sedition laws that we are discussing is that they are poorly defined. Vague laws undermine the rule of law because they leave the door open to selective prosecution and interpretation based on discriminatory policies of government officials and the personal predilections. I think somebody has their speaker on. There are sounds we are getting. Yes. As I was saying, these laws have been invoked for a wide range of activities and comments. Recently in India, we saw that the sedition laws were threatened to be invoked for celebrating the rival team's victory in cricket. They have been invoked for peaceful protest by people or for organizing peacefully students, workers, peasants in order to resist repression and exploitation. Even friendly relations with foreign states, so to speak, have been used in addition to public order as grounds for imposing these so-called reasonable restrictions on free speech. However, I think it's what is more concerning for a lawyer like myself who's defending these detention cases in which there are sedition or similar laws that are the basis of charges against activists and students and human rights defenders, is that it is extremely difficult to get even bails as the trial process can stretch for a long period, yet there is a hesitation on the part of government to give relief when there is even a hint that the security of the state is involved in a particular case. This has led to harassment of innocent people and has induced fear in others to speak against government policies that are clearly in violation of our constitutional rights. I think what I can say, which is positive, is that this repression has also now resulted in an environment which has sparked a rousing debate around sedition law, and its widespread misuse by authorities. So I do hope that webinars like this one will be a contributor to that public debate on these laws. So our last speaker today is Dr. Shakil Ahmed Khan from India. Dr. Shakil Ahmed Khan was twice elected member of the Legislative Assembly of the state of Bihar in India. He is from the Indian National Congress Party. He was a student leader and he remains an activist. So over to you, Dr. Khan, for your presentation. I don't know if Dr. Khan is able to hear. Oh, yes, Dr. You have to unmute yourself, please. Can you hear me, Dr. Shakil? We can't hear you. You may have to unmute yourself.
Is it all right now?
Yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much, ASEAN, for giving me this opportunity to speak on this topic, because it is very important these days, especially against the sedition law, because we are facing day in and day out every time, India and everywhere. So first of all, I must thank Anu also, because she invited me for such kind of webinar, for such an important topic. First of all, I will take the whole concept of democracy. Democracy and sedition are different things. Democracy means that you take along everybody. It gives you the opportunity to raise your voice, to dissent, or to include new voices. And if you raise something and it is being curbed, that is not acceptable in modern time in democracy. But we see most of the time these days that if you raise voice against the regime or against any policy of the government, you are being targeted. We see recent 5-6 years that many activists, student activists, politicians, journalists are either in jail or they are being harassed. So this is very important to discuss in this forum. Let us fight it out. So I have written my statement, and I'm going to read that statement. That will give the whole idea of my thinking. So I'm just reading it out. I agree with this completely, because in India, like in many other countries, sedition was made a law by British colonialism to subjugate local people and curb any movement or dissent against the British Raj. It is the law that was used to imprison many leaders of the Indian national movement like Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, and others. It is indeed an unfortunate anomaly in independent India. The Constitution of India provides all its citizens the right to express our views and speak the truth to power, debate, discussion, and freedom of assembly alongside accountable dissent that doesn't incite hatred or violence amongst the other citizens. Without dissent, no other fundamental right is safe. Freedom of speech and expression, especially in India, under Article 19 of the Indian Constitution, is a basic fundamental right, and if denied, regimes will rise to practice suppression and oppression. In recent time, in July, just in July, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India gave a clear message in the open court that the sedition law, Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code, is being misused by authorities to trample citizens' fundamental rights and freedoms. The Chief Justice questioned the need for continuing this law. I am disheartened, and it is particularly sad that in India, the use of sedition, especially, which I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are being harassed by this law. Other judges like Justice Chandrachud also have repeatedly criticized the law of sedition and its use for must be repressed. The only solution in sight is the annulment of sedition and suppression laws which suffocate dissent on an international level. International laws and pressure should also be brought forward to favor freedom of expression and right to assembly. Lastly, I would say that honest and fair criticism strengthens not only democracy, but the very country that allows debate and criticism. Regimes that came out of democracy needs to strengthen and not weaken democratic norms and principles. I call for an end to the laws of sedition in every country that still it has. And lastly, I will definitely, because we are a social activist, in many places of either in Bihar and other part of country, we raise our voices. Fearlessly, we raise our voices. We are trying to, unite these voices, and there should be a linkages of such voices which can actually link each other, so that sedition law, such law should be scrapped. We need to strengthen ourselves. We need to strengthen those voices who raise their voices against the regime which suppress people, which suppress the voices, which suppress the democratic rights. That's the end of my statement, and I'm really very, very glad. First time, I'm a public speaker in Bihar, so I speak generally in Hindi and Urdu. So this language is not difficult, but I wanted to express in a different way. But thank you very much for giving me time.
Thank you, Dr. Shakil Ahmed. I think you've expressed yourself wonderfully. And we all join your call to launch campaigns at the local, the regional, and the national levels, and at the international level, to make sure that attention is drawn towards the negative impact of such laws on democracy and the rule of law. And we do hope that people who are occupying positions in legislative assemblies like yourself, whether they are at the regional level or at the national level, will take these messages forward and to inform legislators that it is now something that amounts to a duty of the legislature. If they are all looking towards sustainable democracies in our countries, then these laws have to go. Democracy and sedition laws cannot coexist. Thank you very much, Dr. Shakil. We have come to the end of our presentations. I am now going to call for questions. I hope that those who have a question are able to send these to us in the Q&A that is available on this site. So do let us know if you have any questions. I am looking at the Q&A section of the thing. We have only one question. Now, Sarojin Hoda has a question. She asks, what has been UN's role in promoting participatory democracy or the lack of it, and to move to abolish sedition laws and its abuses in member countries? I would like one of the panelists to take this question. Who would like to take it? Natalie, are you?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Thank you, Hina. I would say that the UN has been a vehicle, a means by which lots of normative measures, rules have been created. So I think the UN has very often been used to say this is how things should be. But because of the state and structure of the United Nations Security Council, because of the practical realities of power politics, the UN has not been very useful at all in delivering, albeit that individual UN organizations and bodies have, on the ground, funded programs, done useful kind of things. I think what we need to see, and this is a joint European-Asian meeting, and particularly for the NGOs, representatives from Europe on this webinar, we need to push our nations to be what one academic has called steward states. So states that genuinely do stand up for the rule of law and democracy. And we do have a model in this, in that broadly the Scandinavian states, not always, not perfectly, but genuinely have been seen to act for the rule of law, to speak up, to fund civil society groups. So I think there's a real pressure to be done, a real story to be told, an ask to be made of Western governments, that rather than acting through what's known as realpolitik, which has given us this dangerously unstable, difficult world, that if they adopt principles and apply human rights rules, apply human rights judgments, not as it's so often been used as a stick to beat the people we don't like, whilst allowing our friends and allies to get away with all kinds of hideous human rights abuses. If there's a real attempt made to apply these rules, these norms equally around the world, and to steward these principles which the world has signed up to, then I think that's a way forward, which is not really through the UN in terms of the structures of the UN, but it's using those rules that have been established under UN auspices.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. I just want to add one or two things to what Natalie has said. I think the UN does, in its standard setting role, has done a great deal to set standards through the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for instance. But more recently and more importantly, I think the right to defend human rights and the practical ways in which this can be exercised are contained in the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And I think that's, although it's not hard law, it has become a very core instrument for the implementation of the rights that other treaties and human rights treaties put forward. So I think this is an important declaration. Also, I think it's important to understand that at the regional level, we must also have enforcement mechanisms for human rights. Asia doesn't have an intergovernmental human rights system. Of course, within ASEAN, there is a human rights commission, but that's really not an enforcing mechanism. So we must work towards that intergovernmental human rights system in Asia. Europe does have one, but at the same time, we see that when you lack that system, a lot of what Europe may have achieved or Latin America may have achieved through the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, we have not been able to get. Now Africa also has a commission and a court. And we do hope that at some point Asia will be able to get an intergovernmental system through which we can enforce our rights when our national systems are either unwilling or unable to enforce the rights that our constitutions give us. I have a question. If we have time, I would like to pose a question to our legislators here. We have Dr. Shakil Ahmed and we have Mohsin Dawar. Tell us, how can we help people like you who are sitting in legislative body? How can we help you? How can we help you to convince parliamentarians generally to remove these kind of laws from the statute books? Dawar, I would like you, Mohsin, to answer this question first. Mohsin, are you with us? Can you hear me? Dr. Shakil, I'll come to you then. Just give us a very brief answer. How do we as civil society help you? You're muted, Doctor.
More and more interactive sessions are required, and at the legislative level, in the parliament and in state assemblies, we will have to raise, or we will have to connect with those member of parliament or member of assembly members, and we can have a meeting, we can have a kind of gathering where we can discuss this thoroughly. Then to extend the movement against sedition law can be strengthened. So in Bihar or in other places, we can start this. More and more member of parliament, if they can join, or the legislative, they can join hands together and speak in a similar voice, in a single voice, then the regime can listen to us. This can be one of the area where people can say, because in India there are a lot of movement, mass movement against sedition. When some of our friends got into jail, there were mass level of protest. So people know what sedition is and why it is still there. So we can have such kind of discussion, and there can be a linkages between many organizations and many legislators. This is what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. I think now we are coming towards the end of our session. However, we still have a few moments to hear from Natalie and Dr. Shakil Ahmed for their concluding remarks. I see that Mohsin Dawar seems to have left us right now. So just coming back to Natalie, just a few words on how you see the whole situation as others, your co-panelists have painted it, and what would you be your suggestions for taking forward these ideas that we have expressed today?
Well, I think I would repeat the stress for the need that parliamentarians, legislators are only one person. And what they need behind them, what they need supporting them and sometimes pushing them is civil society. And there's been a lovely example here in the UK where we've just seen the government give way on an environmental bill. We are seeing dumping huge amounts of sewage into our rivers and oceans. And it was, the House of Lords is a very strange, very undemocratic, unelected place, and we still have people here by hereditary right. But it was a hereditary peer, the Duke of Wellington, who actually led the way, but with a huge push of public behind them to force the government to change the law to be tougher on water companies, to force them to start to stop at least pumping sewage into our rivers and oceans with all sorts of horrendous effects. So it's a really good case study of, people can get behind, even where democratic structures are inadequate, where constitutions don't deliver, the force of public opinion is there and can be mustered on what sometimes seem to be quite unlikely subjects. So a message of hope.
Thank you. Yes, I think we are, like Desmond Tutu once said, we are all prisoners of hope. And I can tell you, this is one prison that at least I would never like to leave. So I'm going to go to Dr. Shakil now with a different question. Doctor, you may notice this, that while the civil society does strive very actively to promote and protect human rights, democracy, makes initiatives for peace, mobilization by and large is primarily more effective when political leadership and political parties take on those causes. How do you convince your leadership, say, for instance, in the Indian National Congress, to give a focus on this and give up an interest in control by the state? So these political parties also need to give up that interest in control over people's thoughts, people's opinions, and their ability to speak out freely. Just 2 minutes, Dr. Saab. You're muted, Doctor.
Ultimately, these laws will have to be there in the parliament, and parliamentarians should seriously, and I'm not saying only parliamentarians, but the political parties will have to seriously think about it, because I'm not siding any side, because the last 70 years,
We've lost you.
at the same time, ultimately, people's movement, and at the same time, with the sentiments of the people's movement in the parliament or in the legislative assembly, we will have to work very hard and will have to convince the people, the general masses who votes for us, that look, this law is not good for democracy. This law is going to curb your voices, your strength. In fact, if you want to flourish in modern time in democracy, you don't need such laws, because it curbs your sentiments, your freedom of expression. So ultimately, we will have to go there, and for that, we'll have to work very hard. There are many good examples of that. Legislatives are working, parliamentarians are there, there are forums, they discuss, but finally, together with civil society, together with mass movement and the political bosses, they will have to understand, because of this law, there is a problem, a serious problem. It will take time, but I'm sure, I'm hopeful, I'm an optimistic person. I'm hopeful this law will go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shakil. we really have to end now. It's been a pleasure to moderate this session. I thank all the panelists who joined us in person and those who sent their presentations through video recordings. I also want to thank the organizers of this webinar. And AEPF, I think you are doing a wonderful job in making this into a public debate, the whole issue about the sedition laws. So thank you very much for gathering us all together and allowing us the opportunity to give our opinions on this. I will just conclude by echoing what all the speakers have said, that the sedition laws and their growing misuse by governments of all kinds are a matter of serious concern now. So personal liberty and the right to free speech are hallmarks of liberal democracy. And sedition laws and their gross misuse attack the very foundation of these liberties, which are enshrined in all our constitutions. We need to get together to campaign for our freedoms and for the preservation of our constitutional guarantees. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, everyone who helped to organize this webinar, and for those who attended. I hope that we are taking a very strong message back with us and are able to take this message more forward and to spread it more widely in our own societies. Thank you very much. Goodbye.